Thank you for waiting. Now we would like to go on to the keynote speech. The first session will be from Dr. Jørgen Randers from BI Norwegian Business School, Climate Strategy, Professor Emeritus Randers. The topic is Global Development on a Finite Planet towards 2050. What is the challenge? How could Japan, US, and China help? Please welcome Dr. Randers to the stage with a round of applause.
Good morning. I'm, of course, delighted to be in Japan and in this August meeting, to talk about something which I have been talking about for 50 years. This coming spring, it will actually be 50 years since I first gave a talk on these topics. I have been working all these years in order to make the world a better place, to make it more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, and particularly more happy for people. And in spite of my work, I have not succeeded. The current world is less sustainable than the world was in 1970, and I am getting old. So I am getting a little desperate. I'm really worried about the fact that no one seems to be listening to my very good advice. In this talk, I will get the opportunity to give my answers to many of the wonderful questions that was asked in this session. And you will see that I belong to one group of you. I saw the answers as largely being 50-50. The audience is very split on the important issues, and I clearly belong in one of the categories, as you will see. I illustrate my presentation with a lot of graphs. Those graphs are there simply to impress you. You don't have to look at them. If you don't like graphs, listen to what I say. My words are the important thing. The graphs are simply there to demonstrate that there is a lot of scientific work behind my simple words. For those of you who like graphs, please look at them and please download them after the lecture, because they contain a very, very, very interesting perspective on the world, how it has developed over the last 40 years, or actually 50 years, and how it will develop over the next 30 years. So it gives a wonderful picture of global development from 1970 to 2050. In order to make life easy for you, I will start by reading to you what is my main message. So once you have read this, you don't have to listen to me. You can sleep or play with your mobile phone or do something else. So what I'm trying to say is the following. The world is facing a planetary emergency. It is not only a crisis, it's a real emergency in the form of continued warming, which leads, of course, and climate change, which is the same as climate change. And if humanity only responds by doing what is profitable in the short term, world society will end up leaving a damaged planet to our grandchildren. So if we continue to only do those things that seem profitable from a capitalist point of view, we will do too little, and the effect will be that the future world will be much damaged, destroyed, reduced. And my conclusion is, of course, we need to do much more. And that includes we need to implement measures that are not profitable nor cost-effective in the short term. We need to choose expensive solutions in order to save the world in the long run. And this is my take on the question of China versus the US. We need systems change. We need a change to a system that is capable of choosing expensive solutions in the short term in order to get a better world 30 to 60 years into the future. And American capitalism is not capable of doing this. Short-term voters and a short-term market ensures that most activity is focused on what is profitable in the short term, or which increases the consumption level of people in the short term. So this is what I want to say. If you understand this, please relax, and then you can just follow the show. If you disagree, you are in good company. Most people disagree with me. This is very sad, but it's the truth. So let us start with the first part, which is basically to answer the question, what will actually happen over the next 30 years? Assuming that we continue to do what we have all recently done, which is at any point in time make decisions that maximize profitability, maximize cost efficiency in the short term. And what I'm doing here is to give you a very quick run-through of the 2052 book, which I wrote roughly 10 years ago, which is a very detailed 400-page description of what will happen until 2052. And it's based on a computer model, which is freely available on the web, so you can make your own forecasts if you want to do so. 2052 splits the world in 5 regions, and it looks at the development inside each of those regions. And when you sum those regions, you get world development, and I'll show you world development because of lack of time. And the first slide simply makes the point that the population, the world's population is actually going to reach a peak inside this forecasting horizon, and by 2050 we will actually have a population of the order of 9 billion people, and it will be declining. The reason why the world population will be declining in 2050 is because women will choose to have ever fewer children, both in the rich world, where women much prefer to be educated and have a job rather than having a lot of children. And in the poor world, most people now live in slums. And in a slum, it is very costly to have children, and as a consequence, the number of children will continue its spectacular decline, which is shown in this graph. Concerning the world economy, looking forwards, we will still have an expansion in the GDP, in the production of goods and services, but the growth rate is going to decline. We will not have the plus 3.5% per year growth, which was the average from 1970 to 2010 in real terms. We will be closer to 3 and 2.5 and 2% per year. The reason for this is that when a national economy gets richer along the horizontal axis here, the growth rate slows. And it slows because as you get richer, fewer and fewer people work in agriculture, fewer and fewer people work in manufacturing, most people work in services. And it is very difficult to increase productivity in services, and as a consequence, as you get very rich, out of the red dots, which is the United States of America, growth rates are very low. At lower levels of income, like the yellow one, which are China, you have very much higher growth rates. But over time, the growth rates go down, and as a consequence, the growth of the world economy over the next 30 years will be lower than it was in the past. Energy use, energy is the main input in economic development. Economics always talks about labor and capital, but in reality, it is the use of energy which has lifted our standard of living. And energy use, the red line, will continue up, but it will go more slowly because of the interest of energy efficiency at all levels of society. You can also see that the composition of the energy use will shift. Currently, we largely rely on the use of coal, oil, and gas. And over time, we will electrify society. We will gradually increase the amount of electricity that is being used, and particularly that part that comes from renewable sources, from sun, wind, biomass, hydro, and in your country, from nuclear energy, which is not normally called a renewable electricity source, but at least it is a non-CO2 emitting energy source. And so in this context, nuclear energy is part of the non-fossil electricity. Once we know how much fossil energy is being used in the future, it's easy to calculate how much CO2 is emitted into the atmosphere. And you can see that what will happen over the next 30 years is that CO2 emissions, annual emissions, will increase for another 10 to 15 years before they reach a peak, and then they will start declining. So the situation is that by 2050, we will not, if we pursue profitable actions, cut very much. We will actually be roughly at the same emission levels as we are today. Of course, that the ambition and the plan is to cut a lot, 50% or 80% by 2050. My forecast is that unless we deviate from profitability and from cost effectiveness, we will end up cutting roughly 10%, by 2050. And if that is the case, then the world is going to get very warm. So this is the temperature of the world, and now on a longer scale, from 1850 to 2100. And you see that the red line, we are up roughly 1 degree centigrade over pre-industrial temperatures. We will, if we pursue my forecast, pass through plus 2 degrees centigrade in 2050 and reach a peak of plus 2.5 degrees centigrade in 2075, before the temperature starts declining a little bit 40 years after the decline in the CO2 emissions. So you see the very long delay in the response time of the world system. It takes 40 years from you start reducing emissions until the temperature peaks. The world, and this is of course a rather grim scenario, plus 2.5 degrees centigrade is going to make the cyclones of Japan even worse than the ones you have seen. It will shift weather patterns, it will make dry places drier, wet places wetter. The sea level rise will be of the order of this, which does not matter much in my country of Norway, which has steep coastlines, so it doesn't matter. But this is, of course, going to be a big problem for Bangladesh, you know, where all people are living in the flatlands. But the Indians have already built the fence, you know, north of Bangladesh to keep the people, you know, on their side of the border. So this is not going to be a very nice future. That's the upshot. The world will also, at the same time, press against a number of other planetary boundaries. So it's not only the first graph, which is global warming, where the black line is moving from green territory into yellow territory and into red territory, which means that we have overshot the planetary boundaries. In ozone layer, the next graph, you see a good news. We are actually moving back from the red territory into the yellow and into the green. On ocean acidification, we're moving in the wrong direction toward a more acid ocean. Forest degradation, we are cutting down the tropical forests and the temperate forests, boreal forests of the world. Nutrient overloading, we are fertilizing our agricultural areas to such an extent that this is starting to be a problem for the ecosystem. On freshwater, we are moving towards extreme overuse of available resources, and on biodiversity loss, we are actually facing a catastrophe. We are really getting into the territory where we have already essentially killed all the coral reefs, and we are about to start, killing a lot of other biodiversity. Air pollution, on the other hand, the 8th boundary, we're moving in the right direction. You know, the Chinese have put up a 10-year plan in order to do something, and they are executing. And then finally, on toxics, we will remain in the lower part of the red territory. So in sum, all of this means basically that the margin between human activity and planetary boundaries is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. We are moving, we're expanding and pressing harder against the limits of the planet, and the safety margin is going down. Let us then, since Professor Takenaka asked me to do so, let's look at how this looks if we look at development in Japan, China, and the United States. So here you see population developments. So on all the graphs I'm showing, red line is Japan, China, very big, declining population. The blue line is United States, slightly expanding population. And the green line is Japan, moving down very gradually. Here you see the relationship. China is really big, and the United States is not more than twice as much as you. On the GDP, you see how your economy is going, because you're so rich, you're not going to grow very much more during this period. The same in the United States, while the Chinese, still being relatively poor, will expand, and by 2050 will be 10 times essentially as big as you are, and 5 times as big as the United States. If you look at the CO2 emissions, you see that they are in a way going down when we get to 2050, and the United States is currently declining because they're replacing coal with gas. You are also slowly going down, and then China will still continue up for a while before they also start going down according to their policy. It's more interesting to look at this on a per capita basis. So this is the GDP per person in the different countries. And here you see the green line, continuing to grow even after the 1990 stagnation of your population and the GDP. So you have been doing a surprisingly good job in expanding the GDP per person, even in a period of population aging and decline. Looking forward, there is stagnation essentially in the United States, somewhat more growth here, But of course, the Chinese will catch up, meaning that by 2050, they will be on average as rich as Europe or Japan, and still a little poorer than the Chinese, than the Americans. CO2 emissions per person will come down, and you will be the winner in this game because of your large use of nuclear energy, which I forecast that you will continue to do because it is there, and because it is at least climate neutral. I'll skip this one, and then I will. Sorry. So we are basically in a situation where the three nations of China, Japan, and United States is moving in the right direction, but we know from the introduction that this move is not fast enough. You know, we are declining, so the CO2 emissions are going down so slowly that the temperature will exceed the Paris goals. So it is very slow. And then you can ask the question, why is this shift so slow? I have spoken about this for 50 years, and it is now 30 years ago that the IPCC was established, you know, to take care of this issue. And still, you know, very little is happening. And the reason is, as I've said before, that the green solutions, the climate-friendly solutions seem to be, the green solutions are more expensive than the fossil solutions. And consequently, it is impossible for individual firms to move ahead in a competitive world. They cannot choose more expensive solutions than the cheapest one, otherwise they get competed out of the situation. And secondly, it is very difficult for Western governments to actually put in place the regulations that actually would make the green solution cheaper or cost competitive with the dirty solutions. So, and the reason why this is difficult is that whenever a government tries to do so, for instance, by increasing the price of gasoline in order to make, you know, electric cars competitive, people vote against this because they don't like higher taxes, they don't like higher costs of gasoline, and they don't want to lose their jobs in the dirty sector. So we are in a situation where firms cannot move, and society is unable to put in place in democratic societies the regulations that are needed in order to make it profitable to move ahead. Is there a solution to this question? Well, it was among the questions you asked. One possible solution is to follow the Chinese model, where the elite basically decides what should be done with a long-term perspective. Are there solutions that the golden bullets? Yes, there exists one golden bullet. There exists one simple solution that it ought to be possible to present to people, and that is to cut the use of coal, oil, and gas in an orderly manner from the year 2020 to 2050. So reducing the use of coal, oil, and gas by 3% a year, so that you gradually get to a situation of zero use of coal, oil, and gas in the year 2050. It is important that you know that a full 70% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from coal, oil, and gas. So if you only attack this one single thing, you know, you solve the whole problem. You don't have to think about all the other impacts on climate. Of course, it helps to think about them, but normally it confuses people that there are so many options. Focus on the elimination of coal, oil, and gas, and the graph shows that this in itself is actually enough. To the left, the red line shows what CO2 emissions are likely to do, in my view, all the way to the year 2100. So you see the peak of global emissions in the middle 30s. It goes down somewhere to 2050 and then to zero in 2100. If that emission profile is kept, you see to the right what will happen to the temperature. This is the same graph as you saw before. The temperature will go up to plus 2.5 degrees centigrade, exceeding the Paris goal. If, on the other hand, we follow the blue line, which is a linear phasing out of the use of coal, oil, and gas over a 30-year period, you get the blue line to the right. The temperature keeps below plus 2 degrees centigrade. So this one policy move is enough to actually save the situation. The question then is, how can we move from current situation to one where oil and gas and coal is being phased out in an orderly fashion, over a 30-year period? And we are basically back to two procedures. One is legislation that actually makes the green solution more profitable than the dirty solution. And examples of these are, for instance, in my country of Norway, 10 years ago, we introduced a ban on the use of oil and gas for heating purposes. The ban was put 10 years into the future. In January this year, no one are allowed anymore to heat their homes. And we live in a much, much, much colder environment than you do. And this has worked out. People have had to change, the furnaces in there, etc. A second example is the ban on fossil cars in Beijing. Beijing has the problem that there are too many cars, so they've put in place a system that if you want a car, buy an electric car. You are not anymore, for practical purposes, allowed to buy a fossil car, which helps. Third example is, of course, the great subsidies for sun and wind introduced by Germany in the year 2000, where the government actually paid for the installation of solar panels on the roofs and windmills in the villages. And so this regulative change can very much accelerate the shift by making the correct thing more profitable than keeping at the old stuff. But I have mentioned before that it is difficult for governments, for democratic governments, to do this regulative change because people don't want them. The second thing that could be done in order to accelerate the shift from old-fashioned solutions or from dirty solutions, climate-intensive solutions to clean solutions is for the government to take the lead. So basically, the government starts building the solar panels and the windmills and send the bill to the people as increased taxes or particularly to the rich people, asking the rich people to pay for this work. In this way, you get non-profitable solar panels, floating windmills in your case would be one of the major solutions. The hydrogen society, all of these things will not happen by themselves because they're not profitable, but it's fully possible for the government to start doing these things using taxpayer money. The total bill is not very huge. It's a couple of percent, perhaps 3% of the GDP, so you do not require a humongous tax increase in order to do this, or you do it deficit spending, which is perhaps politically much easier. So that's my picture. So I'm a desperate old human being who sees that the world is moving very happily towards a planetary emergency, considering issues like the ones that you're considering here, which are short-term type of small adjustments to a big system which is running in the wrong direction. I see that there is a solution which is so simple that it ought to be possible to tell people, and I understand that they don't want to listen. I have been told by my younger colleagues that I am a doomsday prophet. And that I should not be a doomsday prophet. I should always end on a positive note. You know, in the sense that I should give you hope that something can be done also inside your sector. And so here is your hope. Here is what you as urban people ought to do. You ought to do 3 things. The first one is what you are already doing, which is to strengthen ongoing initiatives to reduce climate gas emissions. For instance, pushing energy efficiency, local production of renewable power and heat, public transport, electrification of transport and heating and air conditioning, smart grids, local storage, waste handling. These are all the things that you will be talking about over the next 2 days. They are important, but they are not solving the problem. That's the important. The second thing cities ought to start doing is to lobby for national legislation that makes green solutions more profitable. Whenever I consult with big businesses, I'm saying the most important thing you guys can do is to try to get the law changed in such a way that what is green becomes profitable. And that's not unethical. This is actually your duty in this 21st century. And the third thing cities should do is to support political parties that are willing to raise taxes on the rich to pay the extra cost of the green solutions. For instance, renewable electricity and electrification. There is more than enough tax potential. I belong to the rich, to my social class, to pay the bill, the couple of % of the GDP that it will cost to create a better world in the future. And so cities should use this as one of the tools. Thank you very much.
ランダス様、どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Jørgen Randers, ladies and gentlemen, please join us